everybody. Welcome to Square Off.
Liz, the Canada Day long weekend is in the offing, and with it comes the potential for disaster.
It happens every year, Mark. There's a spike of road fatalities, drownings, and other accidents.
And the saddest part is that those tragedies can be avoided.
Yeah, all it takes is a little common sense and planning. Now, we're going to find out more about all that later on Square Off.
What Premier Alison Redford predicts will be a 10-year recovery effort continued today across flood-soaked southern Alberta.
Calgary Stampede organizers are working hard to clean up the ground so that they can have the greatest outdoor show on earth up and running in just 10 days. The province is providing $1 billion toward the flood recovery effort, which will run relief centers and help people forced from their homes. But in places like High River, the recovery isn't even beginning yet, and there's no word when 13,000 people can return home.
Oddly enough, while Calgary struggles to return to some sense of normalcy, Toronto was hosting the World Conference on Disaster Management. Our Glenn McGillivray, the Managing Director for the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, has been attending the conference and was kind enough to break away and join us today at Queen's Park. And Glenn, we've heard reports that authorities in Alberta were forewarned of the potential for flooding years ago, yet chose to take no action.
That's true. I mean, Calgary, where it's located on the river, two rivers, confluence of two rivers, as a matter of fact, is prone to flooding. It has been for many years. We know that. The government of Alberta knows that, and the government of Calgary knows that. After the 2005 event, a report was put out listing measures that the government should take, all levels of government, and it appears that many of those measures weren't taken.
It seems reasonable that a town or city could prepare for a 100-year flood, but is it really financially feasible to prepare for a 1,000-year flood, something that just doesn't happen very often?
Well, but there's somewhere in between the 1 in 100-year and 1 in 1,000-year. In many places in Canada and indeed the world, we don't allow construction on the 1 in 100-year floodplain. It's my understanding that they still allow some construction on the 1 in 100-year plain in Alberta. They might want to look at the 1 in 250-year floodplain or the 1 in 500-year floodplain.
Can you explain to people what that means, Glenn?
It's a probability is what we're talking about here. So it doesn't mean that the plain will flood only once in 100 years. It means that each year there's about a 1% chance that a flood may occur. So it's all about mathematical probability. But you could have 1 in 100-year floods 2, 3, 4 years in a row. It's just mathematical.
Glenn, a lot of us here in Southern Ontario feel fortunate that we're not, it's not often that a natural disaster occurs, in and around the Golden Horseshoe. We feel lucky for that, and of course terrible for people in Alberta, for example. But experts like yourself have been warning that Canada, the country's infrastructure, is becoming more vulnerable to natural disasters like the flooding due to the rising maintenance costs and, of course, climate change. Do you have a ballpark figure of what a national infrastructure facelift might cost?
There have been various numbers come out over the years. Federation of Canadian Municipalities has put the number at somewhere around $123 billion. When you include other types of infrastructure, I've seen numbers as high as $1 trillion. It depends on what you put into the definition. But certainly we're way behind the 8 ball on this, and we really have to look at critical infrastructure, including things like wastewater management.
Glenn, politicians always hate to be the one seen raising taxes, even if it's for our own good, like preparation for a flood. Is private enterprise willing to share in the cost of upgrading infrastructure and preparing for disaster?
There have been numerous examples of public-private partnerships all over the world. There are companies like Swiss Reinsurance Company, for example, that really push the idea of public-private partnerships. And I think they work in many circumstances, and we really have to take a look at some of the options that are available to us.
Glenn, when I see these horrible pictures of people involved in natural disasters, the first thought that comes to mind is, boy, why would anybody want to live that close to a potential problem? Yet at the same time, I wonder if urban planners simply chose to ignore the possibility of extreme weather when they put these communities in floodplains.
It's always hard to get inside the minds and figure out what was going on here. I know that at a municipal level, municipalities always like to see that new tower go up, that new subdivision go in, the new strip mall. That adds to the tax base, it adds to the growth. It helps them with other policy measures. There's always this idea that it's not going to happen to us. It always happens elsewhere. Canada's a developed, industrialized country. It's okay. We'll be fine. But over the last few years, we see that we're not fine, and we see the record hailstorms and the record floods and the record wildfires, and it points to a kind of an ominous future. We really have to act now, and because it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better.
Okay, so let's talk about how it's going to get worse. And you certainly know a lot more about the potential than any of us do. So let's take Ontario, for example, even southern Ontario. What could potentially be in our future that we might not be expecting?
I think some of the things that we've seen over the years, tornadoes. In August of 2009, we had a record 19 tornadoes in Ontario, and 2 of those set down in very built-up areas just north of Toronto, and it's very possible that we could have a major tornado downtown Toronto or in another built-up area of Toronto or some other major southern Ontario city. Flood problems, London, Ontario, Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, lots of places are at risk of heavy flood. And it's not just riverine flooding, it's the floods that we get from the heavy rainstorms, like the August 2005 storm in the GTA. That's about a $600 million insured loss event just from some heavy rain. We're going to see more of that, and for various reasons.
Glenn, we've got about 30 seconds. You're going to have to explain to me how do you guard against a tornado?
Mostly construction, and we see through places like Oklahoma that we can build houses better than we are now. We do build a good house in Canada. We do have a good building code. Home builders do a good job, but we can do that much better just to ensure that our people are safe. And sometimes it doesn't cost all that much money.
I live in a 100-year-old house, so I hope someone was planning ahead when they were building it.
Our Glenn McGillivray is the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Thanks so much for joining us today and enlightening us, Glenn. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.